The desert doesn't just take. Sometimes it gives back. But it never gives back exactly what it took. It gives you the shape of your love, filled with the weight of the bedrock and a refined, smiling hunger that has no name. Some doors are carved into the sandstone for a reason, and some grief is heavy enough to break the world in two. Welcome to Dust and Echoes. My name is James Cawley, and every week I bring you a new original story. Stories drawn from that strange place where memory, myth, and the things we try not to name all intersect. If you enjoy what you hear, leave a comment and share your favorite episode with a friend. Tonight's story takes us into the sun-scoured heights of the 1892 Utah Territory, to a town called Boulder that is built on secrets and guarded by men who have forgotten the meaning of mercy. This is a story about the crushing weight of a father's grief and the terrifying geography of a soul that has been remade in the dark. And what happens when a seasoned lawman discovers that the only thing more dangerous than losing a son is finding him again. I call this story The Warrior Cave. The horses stepped, and the stone rang, and the wind came off the Aquarius Plateau like a whetted blade. It was a high, lonesome country of Navajo sandstone and stunted juniper, and the sun was a white eye in a sky the color of a bruised plum. Silas Thorne rode a heavy-boned roan with a deep chest, and he sat the saddle with a tilt to the right to ease the ghost ache, where a lead ball had shattered his hip at a creek bed in the nation's 10 years gone. Behind him came the boy. Caleb rode a bay mare, and he rode her too loose, his eyes fixed on the red rock spires instead of the trail. The trail was the Hog's Back, a ridge of white stone no wider than a wagon's breadth with 1,000 feet of nothing on either side. A man fell here, and he had time to pray, time to repent, and time to realize God wasn't listening before he hit the talus below. He's looking at the clouds, Silas thought. The boy is looking at the damn clouds, and the stone is waiting to eat him. Watch your lead, Caleb, Silas said. His voice was like two pieces of flint rubbing together. It's beautiful, Pa. I never seen rock turn to fire like that. It ain't fire, it's iron oxide and heat, and it'll kill you just as quick as a bullet if you don't mind your seat. Keep your hand near the horn. Silas adjusted the weight of the Colt single-action army on his hip. The walnut grip was dark with the oil of his palms. He felt the heavy presence of the Winchester 1873 in the scabbard beneath his leg, the metal cold against his calf through the leather of his boots. He was 54 years old, and he was riding into the ass end of the territory to count heads for the federal government. Census duty. The word tasted like copper in his mouth. He was a senior marshal, a man who had hunted the Dalton brothers and smelled the black powder smoke of a dozen border wars. And now the commissioners in Salt Lake City were sending him to play clerk. A test, they'd called it. A way to monitor the secessionist tendencies of the mountain Mormons. Silas knew better. It was a shove toward the grave. They wanted him out of the way, and they'd given him his son as a deputy to ensure he went quietly. They topped the final rise, and Boulder lay below them in a basin of green and gold. It was a small, stubborn gathering of timber and sod, a veil of irrigation ditches and hayfields carved out of the wilderness. It looked peaceful from the heights. Silas knew better. Isolation bred a different kind of fever. They rode down the switchbacks as the light failed. The sun dipped behind the mountain, and the shadows grew long and blue, and the silence of the canyons moved in to fill the spaces between the trees. They reached the town line as the first lamps were being lit in the windows. A man stood by a gate, his hands resting on the top rail. He wore a heavy wool coat and a hat pulled low. He didn't wave. He didn't speak. He just watched the two lawmen ride past, his eyes following the silver stars pinned to their dust-colored coats. "Evenin'," Caleb called out, his voice bright and thin in the cold air. The man didn't answer. He spat a dark stream of tobacco juice into the dirt and turned toward the house. "There's your fire, Caleb," Silas thought. "There's the warm welcome you're looking for." They found the center of town, a wide muddy track lined with a general store and a blacksmith's forge. A group of men stood outside the store, their shadows cast long by a lantern hanging from a hook. At the center stood a man in a high-collared black coat. "Bishop Vance?" Silas asked. He didn't dismount. He kept his hands visible, resting on the pommel. Silas introduced himself to the men, who stared up at them with a humored look, as if they were untouchable. "My name is Silas Thorne, and this is my deputy. Are you Bishop Vance?" The man smiled and bowed slightly. "Yes, sir. I'm the head of this ward. I must say, we don't get many strangers showing up around Boulder. What can our humble ward assist the U.S. Marshals with?" "The U.S. government don't recognize wards, Bishop, just territories. I'm here for the census. We'll need a place for the horses and a room for the night. We'll start the counting tomorrow." Vance smiled, but his eyes remained as flat as 2 coins. "The Lord provides for his own. He is less concerned with the tallies of Washington. There are no rooms in Boulder. We are a private people." A wagon creaked nearby, a heavy-laden thing pulled by a team of exhausted oxen. A woman sat on the bench, her face pale and drawn, a small child clutching her skirts. As the wagon lurched in a rut, a heavy crate of grain slid toward the edge. Caleb was off his horse before Silas could bark a command. The boy ran to the wagon and caught the crate, his boots sliding in the mud. He heaved it back into place, his face flushed with the effort. "Careful there, ma'am." The woman looked at him with a terror that was visceral. She didn't thank him. She looked at Bishop Vance, and then she whipped the oxen forward, the wagon jarring away. Caleb stood in the mud, his hand still raised to his hat, looking confused. "Get back on your horse, deputy," Silas said. "She didn't want your help, and the bishop here didn't ask for it." Silas looked back at Vance. "We'll camp by the wash south of town. We'll be back at sunrise. And Bishop, don't hide the polygamists in the cellars. It makes the paperwork messy." Vance's smile didn't waver. "Go in peace, Marshal." They rode out of the circle of lantern light and into the dark. They made camp under a sandstone escarpment, the rock still holding a ghost of the day's heat. Silas built a small fire of sagebrush and mountain mahogany. The smoke was thin and blue. Caleb sat across from him, cleaning the mud from his boots. He looked smaller in the firelight. "Why'd she look at me like that, Pa? Like I was the devil himself?" "Because out here, kindness is a lie people can't afford," Silas said. He pulled a tin cup of coffee from the coals. "You think you're being a hero, but you're just showing them you're soft. You're showing them you got a handle they can grab onto." "I ain't soft." "You are. You got a heart that's too big for that star on your chest. This ain't Salt Lake, Caleb. There's no law here but what you carry in your hand. You'll leave yourself open like that again, and you'll leave me open too. You understand?" Caleb looked into the fire, his jaw set. "I understand." "No, you don't," Silas thought. He looked up at the sandstone walls, the black shapes of the cliffs pressing down against the stars. "You don't understand that the darkness in this hole has teeth, and I'm the one who's going to have to pull them." He checked the cylinder of his Colt. 6 rounds, cold steel. It was the only truth he had left. The fire died to a nest of glowing embers, and the wind died with it, and the desert grew so quiet, Silas could hear the blood thrumming in his own ears. He sat with his back against the sandstone and watched the moon rise. It was a cold, white bone of a moon, and it cast shadows that looked like holes cut into the world. "Get your gear," Silas said. Caleb sat up, rubbing his eyes. "Where are we going?" "Into town. Every place has a cellar, Caleb. Every place has a hole where the light don't go and the men with secrets gather to talk. We're going to find it." They left the horses hobbled and walked in on foot, their spurs muffled with strips of burlap. They moved through the sagebrush and the greasewood, and the town of Boulder appeared before them like a ghost ship in a sea of silver rock. It was a cluster of silent cabins and dark barns, and the only sound was the distant lowing of a cow. Silas led the way to the largest barn, a structure of heavy timber and sod located behind the bishop's storehouse. He saw the faint yellow glow of a lamp leaking from a crack in the foundation. He smelled the sour mash of rot-gut whiskey and the smell of unwashed wool. "Stay behind me," Silas whispered. "Don't touch your iron unless I do. And for the love of God, don't smile." They found the cellar door. Silas pulled it back, and the heat from below hit him like a physical blow. They descended the ladder into a room carved out of the earth. The walls were raw dirt, and the ceiling was supported by cedar posts, and the air was thick with the smoke of cheap tobacco. There were a dozen men in the room, voices hushing, and heads turned as their footfalls descended the stairs. Some were farmers in denim, their hands stained with the soil of the valley, but others were men of a different stripe. 3 cowboys sat at a table in the corner, their spurs jingling as they shifted their weight. They wore long duster coats, and their hats were pulled low, and their eyes were like the eyes of wolves. Near the stove sat an old Navajo man. He was wrapped in a frayed blanket, and his face was a map of deep-set lines, and his left eye was a clouded, milky white, the skin around it puckered by a massive, ancient scar. He looked at Silas, and the one good eye didn't blink. He was a tracker, a man who had seen too much and been discarded by the world. At the center table sat Bishop Vance. He was talking to the 3 cowboys, his voice a low, steady murmur. But the conversation stopped the moment Silas's boots hit the dirt floor. "A census of the dead, Marshal?" Vance asked. He didn't stand. He leaned back, his hands steepled. "I told you, we were a private people." "Well, the law don't sleep, Bishop. Not when there's a job to do." He walked toward the center of the room, his hand resting on the walnut grip of his Colt. "I'm looking at 5 men here who ain't on the ward rolls. I'll need names for the record." The lead cowboy, a man with a jagged scar across his nose and a pair of ivory-handled revolvers on his hips, spat on the floor. "The record don't mean much to a man in a shallow grave, lawman." "Is that a threat, son?" Silas asked. "Because I've buried men twice your size for less." The tension in the room was a living thing. Caleb stood to Silas's left, his face pale and his breathing shallow. "He's shaking," Silas thought. "The boy is shaking like a leaf in a gale." Vance stood up slowly. "Let us all slow this down. Marshal, you have stumbled into a matter of faith and commerce that does not concern the president in Washington. These men are guests. They provide protection for our flock." "Protection from what?" Silas asked. "From the truth?" The 2 cowboys behind the leaders stood up, and they bumped past Silas as they headed for the ladder. They didn't look at him. They treated him like a post in the mud. "The marshal asked you a question," Caleb said. His voice was higher than it should have been. "Caleb, back off," Silas warned. But the boy was desperate to prove himself, desperate to show the grit his father said he lacked. He reached out and snagged the shoulder of the lead cowboy, spinning him around. "He asked for your names." The room went silent. The cowboy looked down at Caleb's hand, and then he looked at Caleb's face, and he smiled. It was a slow, yellow-toothed smile. "You're a brave little bird, ain't you?" the cowboy whispered. "Get your hand off him, boy," Vance said. His voice was no longer a murmur. It was a command. "My son is a deputy marshal of the United States," Silas said, stepping forward, his thumb hooking the hammer of his Colt. "And he's waiting for an answer." Vance didn't look at Silas. He looked at Caleb. Then, with a speed that defied his age and his station, he pulled a small, silver-plated derringer from his waistcoat. The sound was small in the cramped cellar, like the snapping of a dry twig. Caleb gasped. He didn't fall. He looked down at his stomach, where a dark, wet flower was blooming on his tan coat. His eyes went wide and his mouth opened, but no sound came out. He staggered back, his hands clutching the wound, and then his legs gave way, and he slumped into the dirt. "Caleb!" Silas roared. He leveled his Colt at Vance's head, but a dozen revolvers cleared leather at the same time. the clicks of the hammers sounding like a hailstorm on a tin roof. "Don't," Vance said. He held the small pistol with a steady hand. "If you fire, you die. And if you die, there is no one to carry your boy to the doctor in Potato Valley. It's a 40-mile ride through the canyons. He might make it. If you leave now." The lead cowboy laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "Come back any time, Marshal. This was just a taste. We're protected by the Lord, and the Black Rock Gang, too." Silas looked at the circle of guns. He looked at his son, who was curling into a ball on the floor, the dirt beneath him turning black with blood. He felt a coldness in his chest that was deeper than any winter he had ever known. He was a lawman, but in this moment, the law was a dead thing. He holstered his weapon. He didn't speak. He knelt and gathered Caleb into his arms. The boy was heavy, and he was wet, and he was beginning to moan. "I'll be back, Vance," Silas whispered. "Godspeed, Marshal," Vance said, his smile returning. "You're going to need it." Silas climbed the ladder with the boy draped over his shoulder, his shattered hips screaming with every step. He reached the surface and the cold air hit him, and he ran for the camp, the silence of the desert now a mocking thing. He threw the gear onto the horses, and he lashed Caleb to the bay mare, the boy's cries of agony echoing off the sandstone walls. They rode out of the wash and into the maze of the canyons, the horses' hooves sparking against the stone. 2 miles out, in a narrow ravine of white shale, the horse stumbled. There was a sound like a pistol shot, the snapping of a cannon bone. The mare screamed and went down, and Silas and Caleb were thrown into the dirt. The horse lay thrashed in the moonlight, its leg a jagged ruin. Caleb lay 10 feet away, motionless. Silas crawled to him, his own breath coming in ragged gasps. "Son?" The boy didn't move. Silas pressed his hand to Caleb's neck. There was no pulse. The heart that was too big for the star had stopped beating. Silas Thorne, Senior Marshal of the United States, threw his head back and screamed a name into the night, but the canyons only caught the sound and threw it back at him, hollow and cold. "I can show you the path to vengeance, if you want it," a voice said from the darkness. Silas spun around, his hand clawing for his sidearm. The old Navajo man from the cellar sat on a rock 20 feet away. He hadn't made a sound. He sat with his hands on his knees, his one good eye fixed on the dead boy. "How did you get here?" Silas's mind couldn't track how the old man could have followed them. How he could be here? It didn't make sense. "What do you want?" The man's dead eye caught the starlight. "Same as you. A debt paid, revenge for the arrogance of those men." He pointed toward the high cliffs to the west. "High up, in the V of the stone, there's a place the old ones called the Warrior Cave." The man stood up, the blanket falling from his shoulders. "A sacred place of great magic and power. But it is also very dangerous. There are green waters inside that can bring your son back." Silas looked at his dead son and felt something he had not felt in many years, a tear forming at the edge of his crusted eye. He shook the feeling away, but inside, in that moment, in his weakness of grief, here was an unnatural hope, and he was willing to try anything. "I will show you. But know this, lawman. The one who comes back will not be your son. He will be a shadow. He will be a storm, and when the storm is done, you must be the one to end it." Silas looked at the dead face of his boy, the moonlight turning his skin to marble. He looked at the old man. "Show me," Silas said. The Navajo man led, and the night followed, and the mountains began to fold in upon themselves. They moved through a world of white bone and black shadow, where the wind had no voice but the rattle of dry scrub against the rock. Silas carried the boy. His hip was a red-hot iron in his side, and every step was a separate penance. "He's gone, Silas," a voice whispered in the back of his mind. "You're carrying meat and bone into a hole in the ground, and the stars are laughing at you." "How much further?" Silas rasped. The old man did not turn. "We are almost to the throat." As they entered a narrow canyon heading higher, Silas noticed the way the old man moved. It was unnatural for a man of his age, graceful, cat-like. The sky was a thin ribbon of velvet far above, and the air grew heavy with the smell of wet iron and ancient water. They reached a shelf of sandstone 1,000 feet above the valley floor. Ahead, the cliff face was split by a perfect vertical V, a jagged wound in the bedrock that seemed to bleed darkness. The old man stopped and finally turned and gestured at the opening behind him with his chin. "This is the warrior cave. I will go no further. You must take him the rest of the way on your own. The old ones do not like the smell of a living man who has seen his own end." The boy was stiffening and his skin was the color of wood ash. "You told me he wouldn't be the same," Silas said. "He will have the strength of the stone and the hunger of the storm," the old man said. "He will pay the debt. But the soul is a light thing, Marshal. It blows away in the wind. What comes back is what the cave provides. Give me an hour to reach the lower trail before you place him in the seep. If I am too close when he wakes, I will be the first debt he collects." The old man stepped back into the shadows. Silas watched the tracker vanish into the dark. He stood alone at the mouth of the V. He looked at his son's face, at the eyes that would never see the sun again, and he felt a tear freeze on his cheek. "I'm sorry, Caleb," he whispered. "I'm so sorry." He carried the boy into the cleft. The passage was tight and the floor was slick with a fine gray dust. As he moved deeper, a faint light began to pulse from the walls. It wasn't the light of a lamp. It was a low, rhythmic glow, the color of a shallow sea or a bruised lime. He reached the central chamber. The ceiling was lost in shadow, but the floor was dominated by a pool of water no larger than a horse trough. The water was perfectly still, and it glowed with that unsettling green hue, and the air around it felt thick as if the oxygen had been replaced by the weight of time itself. Silas knelt by the pool. He lowered Caleb's body into the water. It was shallow, barely a foot deep, but as the boy's back touched the surface, the green light flared, illuminating the thousands of tiny white bones that lined the bottom of the pool. Small skulls. Bird bones. The remains of things that had sought the light and found only the cave. The water didn't ripple. It seemed to absorb the boy. Caleb lay there, his tan coat darkening, his face submerged to the ears. Silas sat on the dirt floor and he pulled his Colt, and he waited. The silence was absolute. It was the silence of the grave, the silence of the bedrock, the silence of a world before men had names for God. He watched the green glow play across the ceiling, and he thought of the Dalton boys, and he thought of the wife he had buried in Kansas, and he thought of the badge he had worn for 30 years. It all felt like dust. He checked his watch. The hands didn't seem to move. He felt the cold creeping into his bones, and he felt the darkness pressing against his eyes. The hour passed. Nothing happened. Silas stood up, his hips screaming. He looked down at the boy. Caleb lay as still as a fallen log. The green light was fading, the mineral glow receding back into the stone. "Caleb?" There was no answer. The water was flat. The boy was dead. Silas felt a hollow laugh rise in his throat. He had climbed a mountain for a fairy tale. He had desecrated his son's body for the words of a madman. He reached down to pull Caleb from the water, to carry him back down and give him a Christian burial in the hard earth. His fingers touched Caleb's hand. The boy's chest heaved. It wasn't a breath. It was an explosion. A sudden, violent inhale that sounded like a bellows in a forge. The water in the pool splashed against the walls, and the green light flared to a blinding, electric emerald. Caleb's eyes snapped open. They weren't blue. They were dark. The pupils dilated until the iris was gone, and deep within the blackness was a faint shimmering glint of that same toxic green. The boy sat up with a fluid, snapping motion. He didn't cough. He didn't choke. He simply sat in the shallow pool and looked at his father. The bullet wound in his stomach was gone, replaced by a silver-white scar that looked decades old. "Daddy?" Caleb said. The voice was Caleb's, but it was layered with something else. It was deeper, a resonant vibration that seemed to come from the floor of the cave itself. It was the sound of stone grinding on stone. Silas fell back, his hand shaking on the grip of his revolver. "Caleb? Son?" The boy smiled. It was a perfect, beautiful smile. It was the smile of a man who had never known a day of sorrow in his life. He stood up, the water sheeting off his clothes, and he didn't look wet. He looked polished. "I'm here, Pa," Caleb said. He stepped out of the pool, his movements possessing a grace that made Silas's stomach turn. "I'm all here now." We need to go," Silas stammered. "We need to get you to the doctor." Caleb tilted his head, the green glint in his eyes flickering. "I don't need a doctor, Pa. I need to go back to Boulder. I need to see the bishop." "Caleb, listen to me." The boy reached out and touched Silas's cheek. His hand was cold. Not the cold of a dead man, but the cold of a mountain stream in winter. "Don't worry, Daddy," Caleb whispered, his smile widening. "The law is coming back to Boulder, and I'm going to be the one to carry it." Caleb turned and walked toward the V of the light, leaving Silas alone in the fading green glow. The old lawman looked at the pool, then at his son's retreating shadow, and he knew with a terrible, crystalline certainty that he had opened a door he could never close. The light was a hard, yellow glare that stripped the color from the canyons, and the dust stirred in the streets of Boulder like the ghosts of old sins. The boy did not look back. He moved toward the town line with the sun at his back and his shadow stretched out before him, a long, thin finger of dark that seemed to reach the bishop's storehouse before his boots ever touched the mud. They reached the edge of the basin, and Caleb stopped. He stood in the center of the track, his arms hanging loose at his sides. He was smiling at the morning. "Whoever shot me, come face me, or be known as a coward," Caleb called out. The voice was not loud, but it carried into every cabin and every barn and every cellar in the valley. It was a voice that possessed the weight of the bedrock. The town did not answer at first. The silence held for a long, breath-held minute, and then the doors began to creak. Men emerged from the houses in the makeshift saloon, their faces groggy with sleep and whiskey. They stood in the dirt, 20 of them, their hands near their holsters. Women and children watched from the shadows of the doorways, their eyes wide with a terror they could not name. Bishop Vance stepped onto the porch of the storehouse. His black coat was dusty and his face was pale, and he looked at the boy in the track as if he were seeing a ghost. Behind him stood the 3 cowboys of the Black Rock gang, their ivory-handled revolvers glinting in the new light. "Well, you are tougher than you look, boy. You must have a favor owed from the Lord. Being gut shot, I figured you'd be in his holy embrace hours ago," Vance said. His voice was thin, but the arrogance remained. Caleb stepped forward. He didn't look at the crowd. He looked only at Vance. "It was you, right?" Caleb asked. He pointed a finger at the bishop. "The small gun, the silver one. All my actions are directions from the Lord, inspired and directed to protect his people, serving him. Nothing more, nothing less, nothing personal," Vance said, though his hand was shaking as he gripped the porch rail. The lead cowboy, a man with a jagged scar across his nose and a pair of ivory-handled revolvers on his hips, stepped down into the street. He pulled a Colt single-action army, and he cocked it. The sound a sharp, mechanical insult in the silence. "I'll finish it this time. We'll put the bodies in the ravine like the rest, Bishop. You can shoot me again all you'd like. But I'm here to kill you," Caleb said, his smile never wavering. He spoke to Vance, ignoring the cowboy with the gun. "Let me do that, and I'll let the rest of you live. If not, well, it's your call." Silas hobbled forward, his hand raised, still out of breath. "Caleb, stop! We can take them to the law. We can resolve this. Don't do this, son." Caleb turned his head. It was a slow, fluid motion. The green glint in his eyes was a fire now, a toxic emerald burning in the center of the dark.
"Stay out of this, old man,"
Caleb said. The voice was deep, resonant, a vibration that Silas felt in his teeth. Silas recoiled as if he had been struck. He looked at the boy, at the thing wearing his son's face, and he saw the darkness he had let loose. It wasn't revenge. It was a hunger. Vance took a step back. "What the hell is this? What are you?" The lead cowboy fired. The bullet took Caleb in the left shoulder, spinning him halfway around. Silas cried out, but the boy didn't flinch. He didn't even grunt. He simply turned back to the crowd, his smile widening until it was a mask of white teeth.
"I see you made your decision,"
Caleb whispered. Then he yelled, the sound echoing off the cliffs.
"I suggest all women and children return to their homes now. You have 5 seconds.
The crowd shifted. The tension of the unnatural made the world stop for a moment. Then motion. Women pulled young ones inside, the cry of a baby muted as shutters were closed and locked. 3 of the men turned and ran for their houses, slamming the doors. The rest held their ground, 20 guns cocked and ready. 3, 2, 1. Caleb turned to Silas. "Daddy, give me your gun. Now!" Silas didn't think. He pulled the Colt from his holster and threw it. The heavy revolver spun through the air and Caleb caught it in his right hand, and the world seemed to fracture. The boy spun. He didn't move like a man. He moved like a shutter snap, a blur of motion that defied the eye. Silas's jaw hung open. In all his years as a lawman, he had never seen a revolver fired that fast with that much accuracy. It just isn't possible. But it was witnessed. 6 shots timed like a single roll of thunder. 6 men in the front rank fell, each with a hole placed perfectly between the eyes. As the man nearest to him hit the dirt, Caleb snagged a Winchester Model 1892 from the dying man's hands with a motion so fast, it looked like magic. He didn't aim. He just fired, the lever of the rifle working in a rhythmic, clattering song. He walked forward into the hail of lead, bullets tearing his coat and grazing his skin, and he didn't slow down. He grabbed a cowboy by the hair and snapped his neck with a casual, sickening pop, while still firing the rifle with his other hand. The Black Rock leader tried to run, but Caleb picked up a stone from the track and threw it. The rock struck the man in the base of the skull, killing him instantly. Vance was on his knees now, the silver derringer forgotten in the dirt. He was sobbing, his prayers turning into a wordless wail. Caleb reached him and he didn't use a gun. He used his hands. When it was over, the street of Boulder was a red ruin. 14 men lay in the mud. The remaining outlaws stood with their hands in the air, their faces gray with a terror that would never leave them. Caleb stood over Vance's body. He looked down at the bishop. Then he turned to Silas.
"Did I do good, Daddy?"
Caleb asked. He was drenched in blood, but he looked satisfied. He looked at peace. He walked to Silas and handed him the bishop's silver pistol. "You made me," Caleb said. His voice was Caleb's again, thin, young, needy. "You brought me back. You're the only one a bullet will work for now, Pa, because you're the one who owns the debt." Caleb took Silas's hand, the one holding the silver pistol, and he pressed the muzzle against his own heart. He was still smiling. "Now," Caleb whispered, "you have to decide if I live or die." Silas looked into the boy's eyes. He saw the green glint fading, replaced by a deep, bottomless sorrow. For a second, he saw his son, the boy who liked the fire on the rocks, the boy who was too kind for a star. I can save him, Silas thought. I can use this power for the law. We can clean up the territory. We can be a team. The excuses felt like ash in his mouth. He felt the darkness of the cave pulsing in the boy's chest, a cold, rhythmic heart that wasn't human. He knew what he had to do. He had promised the old man. He had promised the world. His finger tightened on the trigger. The silver hammer clicked back. Silas Thorne looked at the face of his only son, and his hand began to shake. He thought of the wagon in the mud, and he thought of the boy's heart, and he thought of the silence of the canyons. He couldn't do it. The revolver fell from his hand, thudding into the dirt. Caleb's smile changed. It wasn't the smile of a son anymore. It was the smile of a predator that had finally been unchained. He leaned forward and kissed Silas on the forehead, his lips as cold as ice.
"Thank you for letting me free, Daddy,"
Caleb whispered. The boy turned to the remaining cowboys, the ones who had been ready to kill him minutes before. He grabbed the reins of a nearby horse and swung into the saddle with a terrifying grace.
"If you don't ride with me,"
Caleb called out to the survivors,
"you ride against me. Join me and let's go have some fun."
The men didn't hesitate. They ran for their horses, their eyes fixed on the boy as if he were a new and terrible god. They rode out of Boulder in a cloud of dust, the sound of their hooves a drumbeat of coming war. Silas Thorne fell back into the dirt, the sun hammering his face. He had just let the devil into the world. And the devil was wearing the face of the only thing he had ever loved. He closed his eyes. But the green light was still there, burning in the dark. That was The Warrior Cave, written and performed by the author, me, James Cawley. There is a specific kind of silence that follows a gunshot that never happens. It's the sound of a debt being signed over from the dead to the living. We often think of grief as a weight we carry alone, but Silas Thorne reminds us that the most terrifying burden isn't the body we put into the earth. It's the hand of the one we drag back out of it. We pray for miracles in the desert, forgetting that the stone is indifferent to our morality, and that sometimes a father's love is just a key to a door that should have stayed locked forever. My name is James Cawley, and you're listening to Dust and Echoes. If you like stories like this, stories that taste of desert grit and blood-deep secrets, where the silence of the frontier meets the cold, unforgiving geometry of the uncanny, you're in the right place. I release a new original story in cinematic audiobook format every single week, right here. Until next time, remember this: the hardest thing is not to bury what we lost. It's the knowing we never appreciated it while it was still here.